I feel really privileged to be part of this year-long conversation and this year-long effort to put some ideas out there about how we might, to paraphrase President Biden, build back better. So, how do we get here? I want to start there. At noon on January 20th, 2025, which was somehow only 15 months ago, I ended my tenure as administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, an institution that, as you heard, for more than 6 decades, had been the world's leading provider of development and humanitarian assistance. Walking out of the Ronald Reagan building in downtown Washington, D.C. for the very last time, I took in the photos on the walls, photos from all generations, photos of kids getting their measles vaccines, farmers planting seeds that I knew were drought resistant, girls raising their hands to try to get their teachers' attention in USAID-funded classrooms. I felt a profound gratitude to have had the chance to work among those 14,000 American and international staff who, I reflected as I was leaving USAID, never seemed even a little bit self-conscious or corny in admitting when asked what they intended to do on a given day. They would say, I'm going to try to change the world today. That was the spirit, that was the culture. I have been blessed in my career, as you heard, to have had some amazing jobs through a lot of serendipity, but this job was easily the best and the most fulfilling. Since President Kennedy established USAID in 1961, the agency made a profound difference. Between 2000 and 2021 alone, so just over a little more than 2 decades, the agency is credited with helping to prevent more than 92 million deaths. That's just in 21 years. USAID, as some of you know, played a central role helping eradicate smallpox, dramatically reducing the prevalence of polio, and preventing 25 million deaths among people living with HIV/AIDS. It has helped millions of children access education, supported livelihoods and entrepreneurship, particularly among women, and responded to humanitarian crises from Ukraine and Sudan to Gaza and Haiti. And I hope we'll have a chance in the discussion period to talk about any of those crises or any of the things that USAID worked on and any questions or comments you may have. Beyond any single metric, though, and I've just given you a few metrics, particularly in the public health space, USAID's most enduring accomplishment may be the trust that it built over time with local partners around the world. The demonstration repeated across decades and crises that the United States is a partner not only to governments, but to peoples, to communities. When I walked out of those doors on my last day, I expected that the incoming administration would make significant changes. Of course, I had that expectation. I worried, as a lot of us did, that the agency's important work helping communities electrify, really poor communities, very far off the electrical grids, that were electrifying using renewables, I worried that that support would be cut off. I worried that USAID's support for family planning, its efforts to combat corruption, that these kinds of programs would almost certainly face significant cuts. But I also knew that the vast majority of USAID's programs, those focused on global health, on humanitarian assistance, on education, had never faced any serious threat to their continuation. What I did not anticipate was that an institution that had long rested on broad bipartisan support, one grounded in the idea that modest investments abroad could advance America's interests at home by preventing pandemics from reaching our shores, by expanding markets for US goods, by promoting democracy and freedom, all for less than 1% of the federal budget each year, it never occurred to me that an agency that did that kind of work, whose programs had never been in serious jeopardy at scale, could be ravaged in a matter of days. But on January 20th, 2025, I leave at noon, and by the end of that day, President Trump's first day back in office, he had ordered an abrupt halt to US foreign assistance. NGO and UN partners were forced to suspend providing food and medicine to the world's most vulnerable, even if USAID's money had already purchased those life-saving goods. Thousands of health clinics shuttered overnight. Mothers who had traveled hours with sick children were turned away from receiving medicines that they could see on shelves over the shoulders of apologetic nurses. By March of 2025, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, once a vocal champion of USAID's work, had officially terminated nearly 85% of USAID's portfolio. That's between January 20th and by the end of March last year. By July 2025, the Trump administration said the agency had ceased to exist. The projected consequences of these cuts have, of course, by now come starkly into focus. According to a peer-reviewed study in The Lancet, the abrupt termination of assistance is expected to result in 14 million preventable deaths by 2030, including 4.5 million deaths of kids under the age of 5. Some credible estimates suggest that around 800,000 people may have already died because of disruptions to services, more than half of them children. And in 2025, last year, for the first time in over a century, global mortality among children under 5 increased. For the first time in more than a century. Here at Cornell, I don't have to tell some of you, the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences hosted a Feed the Future Innovation Lab that was supported by USAID. The lab was part of a nationwide effort to connect America's best agronomists and environmental scientists with farmers and communities in the developing world. Many of the people who worked on those programs are here tonight, so I would like to thank you for your service. It never gets easy to talk about the people whose lives were affected by these choices. You who are here, who did this work, worked in some of the toughest places in the world, tackling food insecurity across dozens of countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. You pioneered bottom-up strategies in crop improvement that reduced malnutrition and hunger at scale. Unfortunately, the grant that supported these efforts was one of those terminated, and as I understand it, some $85 million in USAID funds for Cornell were lost, undercutting not only global efforts to combat malnutrition, but undermining US scientific leadership as well. To be clear, even if you believe that a recalibration of US priorities was warranted, even if you embrace the idea that America first entails making cuts of this magnitude, the manner in which these cuts were made is unforgivable. Where there could have been a glide path with advance warning to USAID's partners and local communities to responsibly draw down programs and minimize harms, the Trump administration insisted on an abrupt funding cliff. And beyond the heartless manner in which the men, it was only men, who dismantled USAID, beyond the heartless manner with which they went about it, American disengagement from foreign assistance isn't leaving a neutral void now. It leaves a vacuum that is being filled by preventable disease, by worsening famine, by instability, by further declines in democratic civic space and freedom, as well as being filled by geopolitical actors who are less aligned with the values that have long underpinned American leadership in the international aid system. In light of these harms, however, we don't have the luxury of cursing the darkness, tempting though that sometimes is. Instead, we have to use the coming months and years, much as you have used the last year, to work aggressively together to do, in my view, three things. Rebut the false assumptions about why USAID was dismantled, as well as the lies about its work. I think this is more important than it has been given credit for over this last 15 months. Demonstrate the effectiveness of US assistance in advancing an idea that I will borrow tonight from Alexis de Tocqueville, the idea of self-interest rightly understood, and learn from what we have done in the past to do better, including by getting better at leveraging US assistance to secure support from allied governments, from the private sector, from philanthropy, from universities, and from the diaspora. So first, I'm going to speak a little bit about the importance of correcting the record. It can feel a little bit retrospective, but as you'll hear, I think this is really important and maybe not being done enough, including by the friends of USAID in Washington and elsewhere. My own belief is that we are going to have fairly limited success revitalizing a broad bipartisan coalition behind foreign assistance if we don't correct the assumptions and claims that have been massively distorted over the last year plus. I believe that people both happy and unhappy with the destruction of USAID have wittingly or unwittingly fed several misleading ideas. That support for USAID with the US public had been waning. That congressional Republicans had turned against support for US assistance or turned against USAID. That America First and MAGA even had been swept into office intending to tear down USAID. I don't see any evidence of any of those three things as being true. And in the discussion, I welcome countervailing opinions or facts to the contrary. The truth is, as I see it at least, throughout its 6 decades of existence, while debates over priorities and spending levels were routine, USAID had come to enjoy a remarkably broad and seemingly durable base of bipartisan support. Irrespective of who occupied the White House, Congress repeatedly affirmed that international development was a central pillar of American foreign policy alongside defense and diplomacy. Some of you know the 3 Ds: development, defense, diplomacy. It was kind of a truism. That strong bipartisan consensus was evident in July 2024, 4 months before President Trump won re-election, when a Republican-controlled House passed a budget bill appropriating more than $40 billion for USAID programs. Not even Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for a complete overhaul of the federal government, had set USAID in its sights. Dismantling USAID was nobody's plan. Indeed, in February of this year, of 2026, almost exactly 1 year after USAID workers were forced out of the Ronald Reagan building, President Trump himself signed into law a new foreign aid bill that includes $50 billion for US assistance and international programs for the year. Now, this is a smaller assistance bill than the last year of President Biden's term, but it is smaller by 16%. About half of the money in this budget bill that President Trump signed, a full $25 billion, would go to programs that were previously managed by USAID. These funds include $9 billion for improving global health, $5.5 billion for responding to humanitarian crises, and billions in direct financing support for close US allies. The bill also includes funds that strengthen America's strategic competitiveness in Asia, including $1.8 billion for the Indo-Pacific Strategy and $400 million for something called the Countering People's Republic of China Influence Fund, which is a very flexible fund for development projects, or has been. So we need to correct the record lest it become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Republican Party didn't choose to kill foreign assistance. Quite the contrary, many Republican members of Congress were fervent champions of the work that USAID did overseas. They understood better than most the inherent value that it brought back to the American people. At one of my budget hearings at the Senate Appropriations Committee, while I was administrator, I had a memorable exchange with South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. And I'm going to quote from this, from Lindsey Graham, who said, "USAID is a very valuable part of our national security strategy. I see it as part of national security in a different form. The people that work for you directly put their lives at risk, and that is very much appreciated. I love the work we do, and it's one area in the Congress where we tend to come together, and I want to keep it that way," he said. And this didn't even stand out to me at the time because it was fairly typical, which isn't to say there weren't outliers or skeptics of foreign assistance, but I'm talking about in the main, the party coming together to rally around these kinds of programs. I remember like it was yesterday how affirmed the USAID team and some of our implementing partners felt all around the world when Senator Graham went on to say, "If it were up to me, I'd give you more money, not less," adding that USAID's work, quote, "prevents wars, stabilizes regions, and is a lot cheaper than sending American troops," end quote. Republican members of the House and Senate carved out their own distinct agendas, developing deeply held priorities and even passion projects abroad. These efforts were heartfelt, and they were pursued usually with persistence and a clear sense of the connection between the outcomes of foreign assistance programs and the interests of the American people. In reality, USAID's rapid dismantlement came about for reasons that were not rooted in one party's political objectives. Instead, the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, and his Doge team of young tech bros chose to abruptly terminate programs that were helping the world's poorest. Over the course of just a few weeks, Elon Musk amplified and disseminated a wave of viral disinformation, misinformation about USAID, characterizing the agency and its roughly 14,000 employees as criminal. These claims appeared to either shape the perceptions of Donald Trump or become the alibi of Donald Trump, who began to use his large megaphone to amplify the lie that USAID had been overtaken by radical left lunatics, misguided by the so-called woke ideology, and operating against the will of both Congress and the American people. The Trump administration initially justified proposed cuts to USAID by alleging fraud, waste, and abuse. It was a claim designed to resonate. It was simple, it was intuitive, and it was difficult to dismiss, especially as they had shut down the USAID website, where a lot of the information to rebut these falsehoods was stored. On February 3rd, the White House released a statement titled, quote, the title is, "At USAID, waste and abuse runs deep," end quote. That was the header on the press release. By then already, they had omitted reference to the word fraud, because that they could even find, I guess, no lies to circulate. The release cited 11 programs. USAID, at that time, just to be clear, was running 6,000 programs. 4 of the programs they listed were not administered by USAID. Rather than drawing from programmatic records, audits, or budget documentation, even though DOGE was in all of the systems and had access to all of that data, the claims relied on hyperlinks to tabloid coverage from outlets such as the Daily Mail and the Daily Caller UK. Not a single example linked to a primary or a credible source. Even though DOGE had obtained access to all of USAID's data and financial systems, as I said, they found nothing usable, nothing that was real and usable. So they shifted their account from the waste and abuse line of criticism to the ideology and identity-based themes. Here, administration officials moved further away from refutable fact, laying the groundwork for a broader misinformation campaign that is proving much harder to unwind. And I'm going to do my best here very quickly, because I want to get to the affirmative agenda, but very quickly to rebut a handful of these lies. No, USAID did not operate as a rogue agency advancing an independent agenda abroad. Nearly 90% of USAID programming was earmarked or directed by Congress for specific sectors and regions, meaning the agency's priorities, much to my regret and my predecessor's regret, were overwhelmingly set through the legislative appropriations process. Even if we had wanted to, USAID could not provide funding to a specific development program without first notifying Congress. When Congress wanted to prevent USAID from doing something out in the world, congressional leaders from one of the agency's oversight committees could place holds on the movement of funds. And they did this all the time, not because they were woke or because of some ideology, but because they decided they didn't like a program that USAID had sought to move out on. No, USAID did not fund a DEI musical in Ireland. No. No, USAID did not fund abortion services. In fact, since the passage of the Helms Amendment in 1973, it has been illegal for U.S. foreign assistance funds to be used to finance abortion as a method of family planning, placing a clear statutory prohibition on such programs, which USAID, of course, dutifully upheld. And no, and some of you I'm sure have heard this one, USAID did not spend $50 million on condoms for Gaza or for Hamas. In fact, the only contraceptive assistance provided in the Middle East in the last 5 years totaled less than $50,000, not $50 million, and it was part of a global health memorandum with the government of Jordan that was strongly supported by Republicans. Mark Twain is said to have said, "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting its boots on." I think of this often. While the claims leveled against USAID were false, they went viral in far-right circles, even penetrating some mainstream media and painting USAID as an agency operating against US interests abroad. If not for Musk and a handful of nameable individuals, 6 decades of influence would not have been squandered, and the men and women, like some in this room, who dedicated their lives to serving others would not have been cruelly cast aside. A tiny group of individuals used shock and awe, as well as these lies, to cow long-standing Republican supporters of foreign assistance programs into silence. Foreign assistance is not inherently partisan, and as President Trump's own polling falls, we are already seeing more Republicans standing by the programs that they themselves helped build and support. Beyond being more forceful in showing that a bipartisan constituency for foreign assistance remains active, I would like to propose a second approach, which is that I think it really would be good if we can convincingly return to an idea that informed the creation of USAID, and that is the idea, of course, of enlightened self-interest. The idea of enlightened self-interest, or self-interest rightly understood, which is the framing I like now, was popularized by the French diplomat and historian Alexis de Tocqueville. After visiting the US in the early 19th century, Tocqueville noted a strange phenomenon. Individuals in America seemed to recognize that their well-being was closely tied to the well-being of others. Who knew? Tocqueville observed that Americans, he thought, unlike Europeans, were inclined to help one another, not purely out of selflessness, but because they understood that supporting their communities and doing work in the civic space ultimately benefited themselves. Although President Kennedy didn't use that same phrase, self-interest rightly understood, he did pick up the same idea in establishing USAID back in 1961. In introducing the idea to Congress, Kennedy explicitly framed foreign assistance as a tool to win hearts and minds. He stressed the importance of earning credibility and goodwill in developing countries. In a way, he was previewing what we now call soft power. He was very alert to the soft power dividend from foreign assistance. But he also knew that that wouldn't convince everyone. And so he offered members of Congress, people in the American public, a kind of menu of reasons for supporting the creation of this development assistance agency. And that ranged from defeating communism during the Cold War to expanding trade and stabilizing markets for American goods abroad. And it also included broader humanitarian and moral considerations from which he did not shy. In doing so, Kennedy framed what would become the early foundation of USAID as serving overlapping national interests, allowing different constituencies to justify support on the grounds that resonated most with them. The arguments for making significant overseas investments today can't simply be asserted, of course. They have to persuade. To state the obvious, one man's self-interest rightly understood is another man's self-interest wrongly understood. And while many of us would like to take the politics out of something as transformative as making sure that a child never has to die from a mosquito bite, majorities in both political parties must feel comfortable embracing these goals after what has just happened, which is harder. It is no longer enough, we have learned the hard way, to do good work. We have to explain it convincingly and constantly. Honestly, for too long, I think, because of this fairly sturdy bipartisan consensus and the fact that the budgets were sustained and even expanded, because the exigencies that arose, whether the recent pandemic or the war in Afghanistan, always seemed to summon the needs for an agency like this, there was kind of an assumption that the development results and the results of humanitarian emergency assistance would speak for themselves. But in today's information environment, it is definitely the case that if you are not telling your story Someone else is telling it for you, and often getting it wrong, and often willfully getting it wrong. So the challenge is not only to generate impact and to gather evidence of the results of that impact, and that's why the Global Scholars' work and their capstone projects is so interesting to me, because they're digging deep into various countries to see what good the assistance did, what could be done differently, and then what the harms are from it being terminated. But you have to generate that impact and make that impact legible. To connect what happens in a village in Malawi or Bangladesh to why it matters somewhere here in the United States. And bridging that gap between impact and understanding is now central to the work itself. For those who legitimately wonder where the taxpayer money is going, we should try to find surprising validators, faith leaders, and former skeptics of aid who have seen the programs up close or who have dug into the data and come to see how cost-effective and impactful this work has been. We can build out from some shared core priorities where the overlap from both political parties is fairly stable. Pandemic prevention, global health security here at home, supply chain diversification, markets for US agricultural commodities. You can imagine what can go on a list like that. Doesn't mean it's an easy sell now, to be sure. But the constituencies are out there and can be activated. We can try to bring lawmakers into closer proximity with results, not only out to the field, to sub-Saharan Africa or to Central America, but to universities like this one that have developed casework and empirical annals of the returns on the American investment. One of the reasons that the State Department over the last year has restarted some of the public health programs cut last year is that the results of USAID's public health interventions are so measurable and so measured, and they are often breathtaking, those results. I mentioned earlier USAID's work helping eradicate smallpox and nearly eradicating polio, but more recently, over the last 2 decades, USAID funded tuberculosis programs, saved more than 10 million lives, and helped drive a 36% decline in global TB mortality. The President's Malaria Initiative, and it's the President's, but Republican and Democratic President's Malaria Initiative, which received 96% of its bilateral funding from USAID, saved nearly 12 million lives, and prevented more than 2 billion malaria cases. And if you've ever had malaria, you know what every one of those cases means to someone. Even something as intangible as the benefits of USAID to the American people can be backed with numbers. USAID supported thousands of US jobs across 48 states, including farmers and food processors, logistics providers, and agricultural contractors. USAID purchased more than $2 billion annually in US-grown commodities, such as wheat, soybeans, and rice. USAID also sustained a specialized domestic manufacturing sector producing ready-to-use therapeutic food, so-called plumpy nut by some, RUTF, with companies like Adicia Nutrition in Rhode Island and Manna Nutrition in Georgia, relying heavily on USAID contracts that accounted for roughly 85 to 90% of their demand, supporting American agricultural inputs and rural manufacturing jobs. When USAID funding for these programs was halted, those supply chains contracted, leading to production slowdowns and layoffs across US farms, small businesses, and factories. In total, the disruption contributed to tens of thousands of American jobs lost, underscoring that the impact of USAID cuts was felt directly in US communities, not only overseas. Third, and finally, with the politicization of issues that until recently had drawn bipartisan support, we are navigating shifting sands. Important work that was understood to be part of America's self-interest has now been recast as controversial. That uncertainty is real, but for those of you here at Cornell, it also presents something else, an opening to rethink, redesign, and rebuild what international development can look like in the years ahead. And that is why we must spend our time as well learning from what can be done better. If we are to rebuild and sustain a credible international aid system, we need to think also, it's clear, about institutional durability. Any future aid infrastructure has to be built in partnership with the US Congress to withstand the whiplash of American executive branch politics. It has to be insulated from unilateral executive action. If a US foreign development agency can be reestablished, it should be protected by clear legislative safeguards, ensuring that neither the executive branch nor any external entity has the legal authority to dismantle it. Such authority should rest solely and even more explicitly, because I believe that that legal authority, and most legal scholars believe that that legal authority did exist, but writing this in a manner where it would be indisputable in any court of law. We must also identify and address the areas where USAID was falling short. When I joined the agency, the vast majority of our funding went to large institutional contractors and international NGOs. The level of paperwork and administrative burdens, what we call sludge, that prevented local partners from accessing USAID funding, those administrative burdens, that sludge was honestly staggering. And it caused some would-be partners to USAID to stagger in the face of the red tape. Too little investment, I think it's fair to say as well, over the years was directed toward private sector partnership, and private sector partnership really can help us maximize the impact of every dollar we spend. If we try to lower the barrier to entry for a company, if a company is actually creating jobs, that is the development gift that keeps on giving. And sometimes blended finance using public sector money to lower that barrier to entry can be the best use of a dollar we have. Over the course of the Biden administration, we tried, with the support, again, of both parties in Congress, we increased private sector partnerships by more than 40%, leveraging an average of $5 from partners for every $1 of US taxpayer funding. I established an Office of the Chief Economist to improve the impact per dollar of USAID's programming, to scour the literature, the empirical work, the randomized control trials, the impact evaluations, to make sure that we were pursuing the best buy. If you have a dollar to pursue numeracy or literacy for primary school kids in a certain country, community, culture, are you spending your dollar optimally? That's what the Office of the Chief Economist was expanding to process USAID's money through that filter. We committed to directing a quarter of USAID funding to local partners by the end of fiscal year 2025. We had a long way to go, in all honesty, but by the time I left office, at least the number of new awards to local partners, still far too small, had increased by 87%. And we made some inroads in tackling that sludge that I mentioned, much of which comes from congressional compliance requirements, eliminating more than 4 million hours of administrative processes and burdens, and only getting going in the next phase of cutting down the paperwork that it required for local organizations to work directly with the United States. These reforms show that a more effective, inclusive, and accountable aid system is not only possible, but it is within reach if we choose to build on what works. Let me close now in earnest with a message for the amazing students in the audience. Historically, the most resilient American commitments abroad have been sustained not just by presidents or high-level diplomats or congressional leaders, but by younger people who believe that our country's fate is tied to that of the wider world. You all, young people, have an awful lot to worry about today. The fate of our planet, the fate of job opportunities and prospects that even just 2 years ago seemed like sure things, and now feels like everything's up for grabs without the new opportunities yet revealing themselves. It's pretty destabilizing. It's pretty scary, honestly. But we need you, students, to reserve space on your mattering maps for the vulnerable in our own communities and abroad. If those of you who are internationally minded are convinced that our overseas investments are not zero-sum, but positive-sum, that they can prevent pandemics from coming to our shores and again disrupting your lives or the lives of the next generation, if you recognize the simple fact that 11 of America's top trading partners were once recipients of USAID, we need you to be part of persuading others. Some of you will go on to serve in government, some in business or education, some in philanthropy or civil society. But wherever you go, the habits you form now, the willingness to see people in India or Ireland or Iran as part of the same moral and practical universe as people here in Ithaca, that's going to shape whether the United States remains a country that leads in building a more stable and humane world. I know how easy it is to feel overwhelmed. I found last year just flattening. It was the most overwhelming shock, I think, to the system of so many people who never dreamed in their worst nightmares that something like what happened could happen. But if you hear nothing else today from these exchanges, please hear this. The fact that you cannot do everything does not mean that what you do will not matter. It will matter. The fact that you can't change the world doesn't mean that you can't change and affect many individual lives. My former boss, Barack Obama, used to say this to me all the time. It drove me a little bit crazy because I was super ambitious. We can do this and we can do that. And he would say, Sam, better is good. Better is really good. And he's like, and you know what? Better is often a hell of a lot harder than worse. So I'll take better every time. Better is good. This moment should not just alarm you, it should challenge you, and it seems to be challenging you, to decide what areas of impact motivate you, to build unlikely partnerships, including across the political spectrum, to communicate more effectively than those who have come before you, and to recognize that even in this fractured and uncertain international arena, you still have the ability to move ideas, institutions, and to change lives. You may not be able to rebuild what I have described, what we know has been lost, but you can be the ones who build what comes next. Thank you so much. Thank you.